Good evening. This is Barbara Kolm from Vienna, Austria, speaking with you today. I have two wonderful guests, John Fund and Mario Fantini. Both of them are not only related with the Hayek Institut and the Austrian Economic Center, but are also Austrian economists by work, by proof. And what we will discuss today is the outcome of the elections in the United States, although there is still no end result. And we have invited John Fund not only because he is a true specialist on US elections and has published extensively on that. Also, just to mention one of his books, Voter Fraud, and where he has analyzed US elections, but he will provide us with the latest news. And Mario Fantini, as living in Austria, being a conservative, having worked with the parties, knows exactly and will analyze from a European perspective. Mario will also act as a master of ceremonies. So as you know, we believe in the division of labor, but we also believe that in hard work. And this is why Mario has to wear two hats tonight. But without further ado, I will hand over to Mario, invite you to join our next events, which you will see, of course, at our websites, both the Hayek Institute and www.austriancenter.com. And the floor is yours, Mario. Maybe you want to start and provide also detailed information on the backgrounds that both of them have, extensively academic backgrounds that I have not discussed now because I would steal more of your time. But the floor is yours, Mario, and then John.
Thank you, Barbara. Welcome, John, and welcome all the people out there in the audience in Cyberland. I don't want to spend too much time doing introductory comments, but
I don't want to spend any. Let's move forward as fast as possible.
Well, John and I know each other for at least maybe a decade or so, and he's a well-known, famous journalist, I would say, Wall Street Journal columnist and essayist. And as Barbara already said, he knows the nitty-gritty better than I do. My interests are always the philosophical, so I think today we have a nice combination of viewpoints and perspectives. Don't you agree, John?
I think we're going to cover the waterfront between us. Yes.
I think so too. As you can see, I'm wearing my partisan affiliation right on my lapel here. It did no good, apparently. But so let's get into the numbers here for a second. The Electoral College vote currently, and I'll explain why I emphasize currently, is Biden 306, Trump 232. And we probably will have to spend a minute explaining the Electoral College system to some members of our European audiences. But I emphasize currently because there is the possibility, though slim, that those numbers might change. Now, John, I'd like to start perhaps asking you what do you think the possibility of those numbers changing are? Because as everyone knows, there is an ongoing legal challenge, although there have been defeats in the courts to date. What is still left out there for the Trump administration, for Trump himself to achieve with these legal challenges? And will it get to the Supreme Court? And will those numbers change?
There is almost no chance the Electoral College count is going to change. There is even less of a chance that the issue will reach the Supreme Court. What is going to happen in the next few days is that the Trump campaign and the Trump apparatus will continue to raise an awful lot of money on this issue. In fact, in the last 3 weeks, they have raised $175 million. I think convincing people, unfortunately, that there is a realistic chance that Donald Trump can win the presidency by claiming a vast voter fraud conspiracy. I certainly believe voter fraud occurred in this election. I certainly believe there were irregularities. I certainly believe there are questions that need to be answered, but they do not rise to the level of judicial scrutiny and action, which is what it would require, the level of proof a judge would need. And he would need that not just to happen in Georgia or in Arizona or in Pennsylvania or in Wisconsin or in Michigan, but in most of those states. In other words, 3 or 4 of those states would have to annul their election results and declare that either Trump was the winner or that the election was undecided. So as a practical matter, I'm afraid that this has been an exercise in, I think, fundraising more than it's been an exercise in lawyering.
Are they building up their war chest for perhaps a run in 2024 or to support another candidate?
Well, Donald
To
Trump,
pay off debts.
there are no debts, not really. 75% of the money raised for financing this legal challenge is going not to the legal challenge, but to Donald Trump's Political Action Committee, which he is free to give to other political candidates. Donald Trump will pretend to run for president in 2024 for the next 3 years. He will make noises. He will use it to steal attention and time from other potential candidates. And he will convince many that he is running for president in 2024. And then in the end, he will not run. I can tell you this because I've known Donald Trump for 32 years. Not well, we certainly haven't been friends, but I've observed him and known him and talked with him for 32 years. And there's a little known secret about Donald Trump. There is no cheaper person on the planet. None.
I think that comes through.
Well, let me give you an example. In April, when Joe Biden surpassed him in fundraising, Donald Trump started to tell donors, well, don't worry. If this continues, I'll simply put my own money in the campaign. Well, it did continue. Donald Trump was probably outspent 2 or 3 to 1. Well, we now have the Federal Election Commission numbers for how much money Donald Trump put of his own money into the campaign. Do you know what the figure is, Mario?
No.
$8,000. Donald Trump is the most amazing person I've ever met because he has incredible strengths. Don't get me wrong. There are about 5 things he does better than almost any other person on the planet, sort of like Rain Man in the movie with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise. But in a lot of other things, his social skills obviously fall short. But when it comes to convincing people that he is going to do something, he is almost without parallel. The only problem is that the actual record doesn't square with the rhetoric.
Right. Now that's thanks for those insights into Trump's character or lack thereof, as you may see it. One of the things that people have been saying is that Trump will not concede or is not conceding because he's a tyrant or because he's got proto-fascist leanings. But according to my understanding, there is no obligation to concede, right? According to the timeline. Can you shed some light on that?
Well, the networks in the media do not declare who is president. The people who declare the presidency are the election officials in all 50 states who must report by December 8th. And to very quickly cover your electoral college question for foreign observers, the election results must be certified by December 8th so that electors who are the people who have agreed to vote for the candidate who carries their state can be assigned their position. And then on December the 14th, they meet in their respective state capitals and they vote for president. That's when the president is elected, on December 14th. So in theory, you don't have to concede until that point. Donald Trump has said he will concede at that point. The reason he hasn't conceded until now is A, he's angry. B, there is some legitimate reason for that anger. The election certainly involves questions and manipulations that need to be addressed, and not to the level that I think would change the election outcome, but they certainly raise serious concerns. And thirdly, he's just raised $175 million by not conceding. That's a pretty good payday.
That's pretty good. Before we get into the nitty gritty of and a breakdown of the voters and the voter profiles, one last question about this. A lot of people have been complaining that Donald Trump's not leaving the president-elect with enough time to prepare his transition, and that it's important that he concede now. But according to my reading of the timeline that you just referred to, it's only the only time that's necessary right there is from the date that the certificates of the electors are delivered to January 20th, basically a month, roughly. That's all the time they need, right? The transition team and all that. So all these people griping that right now Trump's not giving any time to the Biden team are basically making noise, aren't they?
Well, I will grant them this. It would be, given the holiday season, it would be nice if people didn't have to work as hard
It'd be nice
over the holiday season. Having said that, In 2000, when we had the disputed Bush v. Gore recount in Florida, Bush was not declared president until December 13th. That did truncate his transition, but he seemed to assemble a pretty good cabinet and a pretty good team in that 5-week period that he had. So I think that I would pay more attention to that argument if the same people making that argument today had made that same argument in 2000 when Bush's transition was truncated.
Yeah, exactly. Now let's look at what the voter turnout, because there's several interesting things, at least to me, that are worth highlighting. First, let's talk a little bit about the so-called urban-rural divide. Now, this is not new to this particular election cycle. We've seen it already emerging in previous elections, but it was especially interesting, I think, here because it confirmed what people as diverse as Charles Murray to Tucker Carlson and others on the Democratic left have been saying for a while, that middle America, the working class, the white working class have been disenfranchised. So what we saw in this election cycle, and I know you'll correct me if I'm wrong, John, was that rural voters favored Trump over Biden significantly by a margin of something like 10 percentage points, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, much more, much more.
Yeah, in 2016, it was already 20 points. So, I mean, 10 seems to be kind of a low ball estimate here. And I also noted that the partisan divide between America's urban centers or its cities and those open spaces, primarily in the middle of the country, is greater than ever before. What do you think? Is it getting worse? Are we talking about the emergence of perhaps two distinct Americas, kind of hillbilly elegy and that sort of thing?
Well, America has always had divisions, and the fact of the matter is we have been able to overcome those divisions or put them to one side for a long time, because for most of our history, the vast majority of Americans didn't care about politics because they were interested in the serious business of living. Politics was important. We needed a government. We needed a national government. But the vast majority of Americans still today prefer to spend their time regarding their family, their faith, their jobs, their hobbies, their aspirations, whatever they want to do. Politics has unfortunately in the last few decades become a full-time, all-consuming job for many people. The presidential campaign, which used to last a few months in an election year, now is a 4-year. I mean, we're already discussing 2024, as you mentioned. That sort of gives the game away as to how things have changed. So I think that those divisions were not as important because politics played a less important part in our lives. And I yearn for those days, but they're not going to come back anytime soon. So we deal with the situation we have. And that is that before, Americans used to be divided primarily on the basis of income. If you had an upper income, you tended to be Republican. If you had a lower income, you tended to be Democratic. And that has changed. It's now more a division along rural and urban lines, and also along working class versus highly educated people. And also the income link has been broken. Let me give you an example.
Please.
In 1980, Ronald Reagan won 91 of the top 100 income earning counties in America. So 91% of the counties with the highest personal income voted for Ronald Reagan. This year, 57 of those counties voted for Joe Biden. First time that's ever happened. At the same time, forget the white working class vote. If you go to the minority working class vote, Donald Trump won 26% of that, which is astonishing because that includes an awful lot of African Americans. I'm sorry, he won 26% of the African American male vote.
Yep.
That was working class. That's astonishing. Trump did better among Hispanics, Asians, and Blacks than he did in 2016, even though the media spent the last 4 years with occasional justification from Donald Trump that he was prejudiced or biased against minorities. So I find that the world is changing more dramatically in the political realm the last 10 years than it has in previous decades. And I think it's because the division is not just urban versus rural or on class lines, but frankly, elites versus the rest of the country.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, I want to come back to the topic of elites in a moment, but the issue of, or the topic of minority votes, it was the second thing that I found very interesting about this election cycle, more so than perhaps others. And let me give you a few numbers, and I have them as percentage points rather than as absolute percentages. But Trump, according to what I've seen, had intense gains among minority voters, as you said, 4 percentage points with African Americans, 3 percentage points with Hispanics and Latinos, and 5 or more with Asian Americans. Now, it gets more interesting when you look at minority women. In 2016, Trump had won Hispanic and Latino women by 40%, I think. And this time it was slightly more. Okay, there was slight gain, not significant. But with Black women, he also seemed to have increased his percentage points. Do you have any insights as to what was going on here? And what does this say about the new Republican Party?
Well, some of that may be unique to Donald Trump because his pugnacious, no holds barred, straight talk appealed to minority men more than it did minority women. That kind of machismo, as you would say in Spanish. Mm-hmm. So I think some of it may be Trump unique. On the other hand, there was a clear sign in South Texas and in New York City and in South Florida where you had some real concerns about law and order and immigration, that parts of the minority community, Hispanics, went for Trump on the issues. The vast majority of Hispanics in America are here legally, or their parents came here legally, and they often resent the people who are trying to come in and jump to the head of the line. The undocumented, some would say, the illegals, as others would say. And when Trump railed against people jumping the line and gaming the system, he found a lot of support among minority voters. But the biggest issue here is minority voters do not often vote primarily on the basis of the issues the elites say they should vote on. For most of them, immigration is not a big deal, just as racial identity is not a big deal for a lot of African Americans. They're perfectly integrated into the country and doing just fine. And as you know, those economic gains increased in the Trump years. So in South Florida, Miami, in South Texas, you saw this dramatic shift among Hispanic voters because the Trump years were prosperous years. And of course, when it comes to South Florida, Trump was the most stalwart opponent of Cuba and its communist regime. And that resonated not just with Cubans, but with Venezuelans and other people who have fled dictatorships in Latin America.
Right. Allow me to gratuitously and re-emphasize how well Trump did with the minority vote here again, before we move on to the next topic.
Although still losing it clearly. I mean, let's be honest. He got about a third of the Hispanic vote, perhaps a little bit more of the Asian vote.
But it improved.
The American vote, it was about 12 to 14%.
Well, just let me, I'm dying to read this one little phrase from the Guardian newspaper in London, left-wing, progressive, what have you. And I love when you can use the left's own words kind of against them or ironically. But yes, in this year, the Hispanics and Black women all seem to move away from the Democratic Party, or the Democrat Party, as people have been saying lately. So the Guardian says, in a year when a Black woman was on a major party ticket for the first time in US history, the margin between the parties among Black women shifted 9 percentage points in the other direction. That means towards Trump. I love this, and I think it points to a new kind of Republican Party, and perhaps if there's time left at the end, we can talk about what the contours are of the new Republican Party, although it's been emerging slowly over the last decade or two.
Well, you know, the point you make about Kamala Harris, who, of course, the left wing celebrated as the first person of color to be in a major party ticket other than Barack Obama, is interesting. Because there's an old adage among political professionals in the United States that no one votes for vice president when they decide who's going to be president. And I think this bears this out. Voters tend to vote, again, on issues that are important to them, not necessarily issues that are important to pundits. And I think Kamala Harris's presence, you know, was wonderful for the Twitterati and for the New York Times editorial board and for lots of people. I don't think it moved many votes. It's that simple. And as for minority voters moving to Trump, which was inexplicable, my favorite was the New York Magazine writer who actually wrote this, Mario. I'm not making this up. I'm sorry, it was the New York Times columnist Charles Blow.
Oh,
New York
boy.
Times columnist. He actually said, sadly, we have now discovered that some of we have supporters of white supremacy, and they don't always have white as their skin color. I guess this is a version of the false consciousness argument that the Frankfurt School often uses to explain why the proletariat does not agree with them.
That's incredible, incredible. I want to touch a little bit, perhaps briefly, on the House and Senate and how that looks, but one last question about just the general election. To what extent was COVID-19 a factor in Trump's defeat? You know what the media was saying about his rallies and his supporters, but do you have anything to say about the role of COVID-19 as a factor?
I think that it had negative consequences for Trump in some areas and positive in some others. And I'll give you the reasons. Brad Parscale, who was the campaign manager for the Trump campaign until last August, gave an interview last night on Fox News in which he said his biggest disappointment in Trump during the COVID crisis was he was unable to show real empathy, real concern, sort of the bedside manner that a president often is called upon to exercise in the middle of a crisis, and that hurt him, especially with suburban women. Donald Trump is a rough-edged customer at best, and I think Trump's personality did hurt him in general with suburban women. You look at the election results, you see that. On the other hand, for some communities, especially at the lower end of the spectrum, these are people who can't work from home. You know, over half of Americans have jobs that effectively mean they cannot work from home. They actually have to go out and they have to serve people, they have to sell things, they have to drive trucks, they have to do stuff.
The work.
It's not just head work, it's, you know, hand work. And for them, they were very threatened by the economic lockdowns. So the fact that Trump was working as hard as he could to open up the economy, and we know that lockdowns don't really work for COVID. You can look to Sweden and Switzerland as counterexamples. You can basically argue that he was speaking to their immediate economic needs. They had to put food on the table, and they knew that they were not going to be able to depend on government handouts, which lasted a few months at best.
Thanks for that. So what about the House and Senate? Now, in the week leading up to today, to this event, to this little nice chat we're having, I was looking at the numbers for the House and Senate and the seats that have been flipped or not flipped. And a lot of the sources I was looking at said, oh, still pending, we're still counting. As of 4 days ago, California was still counting votes. Where the heck are we in this? Can you sum it up for our audience?
Well, you know, it's interesting that in the last few decades, everything has speeded up. You can get things done faster now than we even thought possible when we were younger. I mean, Amazon can deliver stuff to you in 2 hours in my city. But the only thing that has gone the other way are elections. We used to have elections decided the day after election. Now we have election month. In fact, I live in New York. We have one district, a congressional district, where they still have 3,000 ballots they're arguing over, and the certification has been delayed. So this is appalling, and that goes to the part of the complaints that some Trump supporters make about the conduct of this election, which was the rules were changed dramatically because of the COVID crisis, and I think in some cases unnecessarily so. But let's look at the Senate and the House races.
Please.
I'm assuming that the January 5th runoffs in Georgia, which are for 2 Republican seats, will go for the Republicans. It's not a sure thing, but Republicans won a majority of the votes for president, for those 2 Senate seats, for the state House, state Senate, and the state legislature, and for the congressional seats. Georgia is becoming more Democratic, but not so fast that it will become Democratic, I think, by January 5th. So leaving that aside, assuming that the Senate is 52 Republicans and 48 Democrats, this is a bitter disappointment for Democrats. I think it will moderate the Biden administration's appointments. I think it will moderate who they nominate, because they're not going to give up a Senate seat in the case of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, who lust for cabinet positions. If they were nominated to the cabinet, their successors would be Republicans. They would be temporarily appointed. So the Republicans controlling the Senate also mean that Joe Biden will have to nominate relative moderates to be judges, because the confirmation process will almost dictate that with Republicans in control. In the House, Nancy Pelosi has the unenviable task of trying to control a House where it looks like she will have 222 members and Republicans will have 213. That means if 5 Democrats get stuck in traffic in Washington on a given morning, she loses control of the House floor. If 5 Democrats from either the left, the AOC crowd, or the moderates, many of whom barely won their races and blame the AOC crowd for slogans like defund the police that hurt them at the polls, then she can't control the House floor. And I believe that this divided government is what people were voting for. The marginal independent or swing voter. And they got what they wanted. I'm not saying Joe Biden isn't going to accomplish some of his agenda, but it's going to be dramatically watered down from what the Democrats expected. In fact, I ran an item in my newsletter this morning quoting Democrat Scott Peters of California, who said, you know, we were very cocky before the election. We thought we were going to have the presidency, the Senate, and the House, and we were then going to be able to ram our entire agenda through without even talking to Republicans. And he says, now that's all gone. So the Democratic majority in the House is now going to have to negotiate with, believe it or not, Republicans. And the Democratic minority in the Senate, which I presume will be a minority, the Democratic minority in the Senate is going to have to negotiate with Mitch McConnell. I think that's what the public wanted. And
I think so too. I agree with
I don't look. The studies from people like Robert Higgs and others. The growth of government spending is actually not least when the Republicans control all the levers of government, and not least when Democrats control all the levers of government. Government spending grows the least when there's divided government.
Right, because it grows regardless of what party's in power. Right? What you
seems
need
to
is
have an
gridlock.
organic power of its own. Yes.
Barbara once had a great Indian speaker come to Vienna who talked about how business grows at night. And I said, and I asked him, well, what do you mean it grows at night? And he goes, well, at night is when all the bureaucrats and regulators and government officials are asleep. So that's when the private sector really grows. It was a funny throwaway line, but I think there's truth to that.
I'm going to remember that. That's great.
No, it's good. I'll send you the exact quote later.
Please, please do so.
I will. Let's I'd like to touch on the what we expect to be the Biden administration in a moment, but so let's summarize what are lessons learned here. I mean, for me, one is that the Democratic Party, and we knew this, doesn't speak for minorities and doesn't speak for Blacks or Hispanics. Number two is that the white working class, the working class in general, doesn't have to be white, has been ignored or has been a pawn for both parties, and that as I kept alluding to earlier, the GOP might have a future as the working class party of America. What other lessons would you derive or draw from this election cycle?
Well, I'll even extend it beyond your observation about the white working class. I think the elites in this country have a semi-conscious plan or program that basically they're going to remain in charge, and regardless of what your skin color is, you're not invited to the party unless you fit into their boxes. Did you go to the same schools? Did you have the same background? Do you live in the same neighborhoods? And I'll give you an example of that. We see over and over again calls for racial preferences in admissions to colleges and in public hiring and in contracting for government services. And over, studies have shown this tends to primarily benefit people of the same socioeconomic status as the people currently enjoying those benefits. So it's rare that if you open up slots for minorities in public universities, that they go to the truly underprivileged. They tend to go to people of the same socioeconomic grouping as the people already going to that school. So in California, there was an attempt to bring back racial preferences. The voters had to repeal them in 24 years ago by a 55-45 vote. And this year they tried to get rid of that ban on racial preferences. And they had $23 million to campaign with, 13 times the amount the opposition had. They had a favorable ballot summary. Every major politician of the state endorsed it, every major newspaper. And they ended up losing 57-43, Mario. And we now have the exit polls from this. More Asians voted against racial preferences than voted in favor of them by a significant margin. More Hispanics voted against racial preferences than voted for them by a substantial margin. And only about 56% of African Americans voted for racial preferences. And of course, whites also voted against racial preferences, but by a margin actually less than Asians. So you have to ask yourself, if the elites put a ballot measure on the ballot that doesn't seem to have any daily relevance to the daily concerns of minorities who are struggling or working or having a 9-to-5 job and working outside the Zoom bubble, if they put this on the ballot and it loses with their target audiences, what does that say about who's really behind these ideas? Right. These ideas are not coming from the minority community. They're being imposed in the minority community by a portion of the minority community and the left-wing intelligentsia.
Right. They're being told these are the positions you should be supporting. This is the platform that you should be behind. But it's not by the way, from them.
Yes, exactly. And by the way, the exit polls show, Mario, that this Proposition 16, which went down to defeat 57-43, immigrants voted much more heavily against it than native-born Americans, because immigrants often come from countries, or their families come from countries, where there's a great deal of suspicion about government picking winners and losers and exercising preferences. I point you to Malaysia as just one horrible example of how racial preferences can divide a country. And Thomas Sowell has written very eloquently about this in his book, Race in America. So the issues, you know, we talked about the House and the Senate, and we talked about the presidency, but let's take California, where I'm from, where we do a lot of our governing by initiatives and referendums and popular votes. It wasn't just the racial preferences that lost. There was a measure to repeal part of Prop 13, the great property tax cutting measure of 1978. It lost. There was a measure to continue the regulation, the hyper-regulation of the gig economy, the Ubers and Lyfts of the world, to basically make it much more easy to unionize them and make them not independent contractors. That lost. Over and over again, and I'm looking across 6 or 7 different initiatives, Californians who voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden for president and were very anti-Trump voted for the conservative position on these ballot initiatives. So there's a division between people's views of personality in this election, at least in California and some other states, and also their views on policies.
You've mentioned the elite several times, and that automatically conjures up the phrase the deep state, or the establishment, as we used to say in the old days. And so one final question about Trump before we move on to Biden. What role, if any, did those powers that Trump threatened so very well over the last 4 years, what role did they play in thwarting his desire, his efforts to win the White House for a second term?
Well, I think that there was almost a combined campaign between the major media outlets and the deep state, the bureaucracy, to discredit the Trump administration in all forms, even when it was clear that they had some policy successes. I mean, Michelle Flournoy, who's Biden's leading candidate to be Secretary of Defense, has admitted, you know, I'm very glad Donald Trump raised the issue of China and Chinese deception in the COVID virus, Chinese human rights abuses, Chinese predatory practices in trade, because it had not been seriously addressed by previous presidents of both parties. So I think there was a concerted effort to declare Trump illegitimate and to proclaim that anything he was doing was bad. And this sort of shirts versus skins, this, you know, my team is always right, your team is always wrong, pervades both parties. And the Trump people respond in kind. But it's not useful for intelligent public discourse. I think the media and the bureaucracy were in complete agreement that Donald Trump had to go at any cost.
Yeah, Laura Ingraham, who I love, had listed some of the actors that were in collusion or in cahoots to prevent a Trump victory. And she said the deep state, Schiff himself, Pelosi, big tech, the media, Wall Street, Hollywood, pro athletes. I'm quoting here, they all did everything they could to destroy Trump. Plus, then the US gets hit with a pandemic that originated in China, end quote. And I just wanted to list those actors among many others for the benefit of our audience, because that is what Republicans, conservative Republicans, those who cherish liberty are up against and have been up against for these last 4 years.
Well,
any comment before we move on to Biden?
Yeah, Mario, I would just make one footnote to that list, which is Donald Trump often did his best to undermine his own election campaign. I mean, that
must be admitted.
I don't think there is a single person outside the orbit of the White House aides who actually thought that first debate performance by Donald Trump, where he played the attack dog without a muzzle, helped his campaign. And it was a wasted opportunity. In addition, it was a wasted opportunity for him to drop out of the second debate. So we only had one debate where there actually was an exchange of issues and ideas. And as you know, observing European campaigns, Mario, when voters focus finally on the issues at the end of a campaign, they tend to shift a little to the right, because that's the natural common sense of electorates. And that didn't happen in the US for many people, because it was focused on the personalities way longer than it should have been.
Yeah, I agree with you there. So what are we going to get with a presumptive Biden administration, a Biden presidency? Angelo Codevilla in American Greatness wrote that this is the return of the establishment. And now they're going to have full reign or free reign to do whatever they want and undo anything that Trump undid during his 4 years, such as returning to business as usual with China, and such things. What do you predict? What do you expect will happen?
It'll be a mixed bag. It'll be a
coming 4 years.
It will be a mixed bag. First of all, the establishment is going to be very boring compared to Donald Trump. Biden will try to use executive orders to overturn much of what Trump did. You can do that up to a point, but it also takes some time to unravel those executive orders. I think that if he overreaches on those, he will discover more opposition from Mitch McConnell, the Republican majority leader in the Senate, than he expects. And as for actually getting legislation through, if it's not bipartisan, it's not going to pass the House and Senate and reach the president's desk. I don't see that the Biden tax plan has much of a chance. I don't see the Biden regulatory agenda outside of executive orders and rogue actions by the EPA to make much progress. It takes time to unravel what a previous president has done. And I think that if this continues, the midterm elections almost always lead to the party in power losing House seats. If Biden gets slowed down at all, we are looking at the prospect of a Republican Senate, a Republican House in 2022 after the midterm election, because the party out of power tends to gain. As a result, I expect that the Biden wish list is very long. The Biden accomplishment list will be significantly shorter. As for what Joe Biden really believes in, I think that he's a classic politician who wants everyone to like him. He's Irish American. He's a backslapper. He's flexible. He responds to pressure. The left will pressure him, and I think he can legitimately say, "Do you have the votes?" And they will have to say they don't. What he actually believes in, I think, is the following. He really is a Franklin Delano Roosevelt labor Democrat. He praised unions very profusely when he announced his economic team yesterday. He really does believe that unions are a fundamental part of making the middle class in America and preserving the middle class. I think he wants to extend benefits to the white working class, the voters that Democrats have lost in recent elections. On social policy, I don't think he's a natural fit for the identity politics of the radical left, but he has to go along with some of that. But it's not his style. And I think you see in the appointments that he's made so far, the radicals have been largely excluded. And lastly, on foreign policy, I think it's basically the Obama administration perhaps conducted with a little more realpolitik. Obama was often very naive. He was naive about the consequences of the Arab Spring. He was naive about China. He was naive about Russia before the invasion of Ukraine and the seizure of the Crimea. I think that the Biden administration will be establishment in its foreign policy, but I don't think they're going to roll back all of the sanctions on China over trade, because those will be used as leverage for negotiation. I don't think they're going to roll back the sanctions on Russia, because I think most of them actually believe Putin is a bad actor. I think that negotiations with the European Union will be more friendly, but I think that Trump has left the Biden administration all kinds of opportunities to play good cop, but still play a cop and stick up for United States interests. So I think Trump has left a decent legacy for Biden to say, well, I'm the kinder and gentler president, but that doesn't mean that I can get away with everything. And I have this Republican Senate and, bear control of the Democratic House. You got to give me something. So we may see the best of both worlds in some of these foreign policy negotiations.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think this is going to be a professional, technocratic administration. I certainly don't share the fears of some of my more alarmist friends saying, oh, this is the left in power. It's not. The squad, the so-called squad, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, and two others, are not in power with the Biden administration. As you said, they've not even really emerged, and none of them have been named to positions of in the cabinet. So I think this will be a mixed bag, like you said. It's certainly not going to be a threat to the kind of policies that you and I and Barbara and others prefer, the deregulatory approaches or the reduction of taxes. I don't know. It remains to be seen, as people say.
Well, there's one thing that has changed in the last few months.
What
The
is that?
Supreme Court now has 5 firmly conservative members on it. That's a majority. And the Joe Biden administration is going to have to, in the back of their mind, realize that if they try anything really dramatic or extra constitutional, it is now going to be slapped down by the Supreme Court, as they recently, just last week, slapped down Governor Cuomo's restrictions on religious services in the midst of the pandemic.
Right, right. We are at quarter before the hour. We can continue for another few minutes, or I don't know if we are set up to receive questions. Apparently not.
I copied 2 questions into the chat.
Go ahead, Victoria.
One was from Facebook. What kind of manipulations? It was posted quite at the beginning.
Okay, I'll take a look.
Manipulations of the election system, I presume, is what she's discussing.
I guess so.
Well, the mail-in balloting changes that occurred because of COVID were almost all done by executive order or the decrees of health officials. They were not done through the state legislatures, which is the normal procedure. These changes were not made with efficiency or ballot security at heart. So for example, let's take Georgia, which was very close, 13,000 votes between Trump and Biden. In the spring, the state of Georgia agreed that they would no longer check the signature on a mail-in ballot with both the registration signature of that person and the signature that was on the ballot application for the mail-in ballot. They would just have a cursory check of the signatures when the ballot came in. And then the ballot envelope would be separated from the actual ballot, and you could never again figure out which ballot belonged to which signature envelope. Mail-in balloting in Georgia went from 5% in 2016 to 27% this year. There's an awful lot of anecdotal evidence, and I've even spoken to voters who witnessed this, that security in some counties, the Democratic counties around Atlanta, was very lax. They accepted almost every signature, and the rejection rates reflect that. Far fewer ballots were rejected this year than in 2016. Does that mean that fewer people made mistakes, or does it mean that there was simply less scrutiny? I think the latter. As a result, a lot of ballots that would have been rejected under normal safeguards and procedures were accepted. And in a state where only 13,000 votes separated the presidential candidates, that could have made a real difference. I don't give much credence or that much credence to the charges of computer software manipulation. I would say those remain unproven. And I think that that's part of a fundraising campaign, perhaps as much as anything else. But the concerns about mail-in voting, which I have expressed for years, were borne out this time.
You know,
There was another question, Mario, on Facebook by Mrs.
yes, I
Krieger.
see it.
She asks, John, do you agree with some who say a Biden presidency will actually fracture the left because they no longer have Trump hatred to keep them together?
No, I think the far left hates us enough without Trump, who, as you know, was not really a conservative so much as he was a populist. I think they hate us just as much as ever. They hate the free market just as much as ever. They hate traditional values as much as ever. And they want power as much as ever. Having said that, they're going to be very frustrated by the Biden presidency, because one of the leverage points that ideological group has within a political party is the ability to threaten a primary challenge against an incumbent president when they run for re-election. Jimmy Carter suffered this with Ted Kennedy in 1980. Well, Joe Biden is 78 years old, and there is no one in Washington with any kind of standing who will privately tell you they expect Joe Biden to be running for a second term. That means he's a one-term president. Now, he's not going to say he's a one-term president, but he himself has already said publicly that he's a transitional president. That's saying he's a one-term president. Transition to who or what? Someone else in 4 years. That means they can't threaten him with much. They can't run a primary challenger against him if he's not running for re-election. And I think Joe Biden is going to call the balls and strikes as he sees them. He is going to bend to the left where he has to, and on issues that are not fundamental to his belief system. But he will hold firm. And if you look at Janet Yellen as Treasury Secretary, if you look at the other appointments, these are conventional, technocratic, as Mario said, liberals. And they're going to be very frustrated. And Biden can always say to them, give me enough senators to pass what you want and give me enough House members to pass what you want, and maybe I'll sign it, but you can't even bring it to my desk. And you remember those Democratic House majorities, a 5-vote majority in the House. Now, there are 20 Democratic members in suburban districts that had Republicans until 2016 representing them in the House. 20. Many of them won with 51 or 52% of the vote. Now, in a midterm election, when the party in power almost always, with 1 or 2 exceptions in the last century, loses seats, how excited are those moderate Democrats going to be to vote for some left-wing crazy idea? Not very. So I think the Biden administration can do damage, but it will be primarily through executive orders, because I don't think any radical legislation is going to pass the House and the Senate.
Good. Thanks, John. Barbara, Victoria, if I may follow up with 2 final comments to maybe.
There is one more question,
yes.
Mario, by Philip. Philip Willich, he asks, John, what's your take on the 2024 GOP primaries? Kurt Mills, for instance, had Cruz, Pence, and Rick Scott as the frontrunners, and Nikki Haley, Trump, and Don Jr. as overrated.
I said at the beginning of this broadcast that it's a tragedy that in America we talk about the next presidential election in 4 years immediately after we've just voted on this one. And here we are. Look, I will just make 3 very quick observations. All of the candidates you mentioned are running. It's going to be probably an open seat, no incumbent. There will be a 4-year record to run against, and Biden will be liberal enough there'll be plenty of things to criticize his administration for. So all of the candidates you mentioned are running except for Trump, who I believe ultimately will not run, but pretend to run for the next 3 years. And lastly, this is a good thing. You know, the Republican Party, like the conservative parties in Europe, often spends time praising the private sector and its notions of competition and let's have the best idea or the best product win. And they rhetorically favor competition, but in practice, they tend to shut it down. They tend to have in Europe party lists where if you go against the party line, you don't get on the list in the proper position, therefore you don't get elected. So there's no real competition there if you can't satisfy the party grandees. And in America, we tend to have, at least the Republican Party, a tradition of, you know, shut up and take your place in line. It's not your turn yet. And Donald Trump, of course, upset that apple cart. And frankly, that was one of the good things about his candidacy. So 2024 will be wide open. There will be a completely competitive field. And that is a good thing because competition in politics is just like competition in business and the free market. It tends to bring out the best and tends to weed out the worst.
Thank you, John. You answered part of Scott's question. His second part of the question was if you see anybody up and running on the Republican side that we should keep an eye on.
Actually, I did answer his question with my initial comments saying, I'm distressed that we're discussing the 2024 election immediately after this election. So that's my answer. I have a personal favorite, but my job here is not to promote a candidate because I'm trying to be an honest broker. And I think you'll note from my comments, I've given everybody flack and criticism. So I will just suggest that don't just pay attention to the names that you hear all the time. Pay attention to other candidates, especially governors. Governors often become president. So Governor DeSantis of Florida, Governor Ducey of Arizona would be two. Neither of them is my personal favorite for the presidency, but they have good records in their states, and I think they're going to be running. And they will join the big boys like Pence and Cruz and Nikki Haley and Pompeo and all the other names that you've heard.
Barbara, would you like me to respond to Scott's question as well?
Of course, you should.
Because I do have a name in mind, someone I never thought I would be enthusiastic about, and that is Marco Rubio of Florida. Now, his tone, his style, his message, and the content of his statements and editorials has changed over the last several years. Although he still seems to be enamored of the foreign policy establishment, too much so for my tastes. His views on the domestic economy and on the role of workers has shifted, and he's sounding more and more kind of like a mini Trump. No pun intended. No reference to his stature, of course. There, I think he's positioning himself, or at least trying to capitalize on what he has astutely identified happening in American politics, which is the emergence of something new, of the party of American greatness, the party of national populism. And I think we should be watching him in the coming years. There's promise there.
I agree that Marco Rubio is a very intriguing figure. By the way, I'll just note in closing, Florida is now our third largest state. I'm sorry, our second largest state in population. Sorry, third largest state in population after California and Texas. And it is increasingly visible in national politics. In 2024, I predict there will be 3 presidential candidates on the Republican side from Florida. Both senators, Marco Rubio and Rick Scott, are running, and Governor DeSantis is running. They may divide up the field, and they may make it difficult for people in Florida to choose between them. But Florida is certainly going to be a major contender in the 2024 primaries.
Thank you, gentlemen, both. Before I leave it to you, Mario, to wrap up and close the session, I would just remind all our listeners to our next Center Right Coalition meeting, which will, of course, will be held again at 9 o'clock in the morning at the very beginning of December next year. And the second thing is we still have another event coming up, the Economics of Christmas, on December 17th. So be prepared and watch with our Italian partners. And finally, our very capable team, and Britt has sent me the information that the quote you did is by Gurcharan Das, who said the Indian rope trick on 24th of May in 2012 at an event that we hosted in Vienna. And he was discussing, his book is India Grows at Night When the Government Sleeps. And we were discussing the financial crisis back then. So it was Gurcharan Das who said that. And unfortunately, things have not changed. The quotes—
Barbara, your crack staff once again.
Thank you, Britt.
Leaves me in awe.
Thank you,
Over
Britt.
to you, Mario.
Thanks, Barbara, and thank you, Britt, again. Boy, I wish our government would sleep more, John. Listen, I thank you for this this conversation. It's always a joy, and I always learn so much. As you know, as a semi-philosopher, my head is often in the clouds. I think more abstract, useless things, but you always teach me how to focus on the numbers and the nitty gritty. So thank you for that. I know the audience appreciates as well.
Well, Mario, you were a wonderful participant as well as a facilitator. And again, I want to thank Barbara and her team for making this possible.
All right, let's look forward to perhaps a midterm assessment of the Biden administration. Boy, it's still, that gets stuck in my craw. It's hard to say that, but yes, in 2 years, let's have another chat.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll look forward to that space in time because the first seminar that I have to conduct on the 2024 election, which I just complained about, is next month. So it's not just an academic objection that I have. I'm now being called into service to discuss an event that's 4 years in the making, but for people in our full-time politics obsessed country is just around the corner.
Great. Thank you, John. Great to see you. And thanks to everyone for joining us for this conversation.